Andrew, I'm going to introduce you with lovely things. All right. I may. Hi everybody, good evening, and it is so lovely to see so many people here in the room, and I know more people will be joining us on the live stream and watching this recording afterwards, so welcome to all of you. My name is Laura Yaris, and I'm an assistant professor here at MSU in the Department of Religious Studies and part of the core faculty of the Serling Institute for Judaism and Modern Israel. It's really a delight to welcome today Andrew Tobolowsky. Andrew is the Robert and Sara Boyd Associate Professor of Religious Studies at William and Mary University. And he's the author of 2 books. His first book was The Sons of Jacob and the Sons of Heracles, the history of the tribal system and the organization of biblical identity. And in 2022, he published The Myth of the 12 Tribes of Israel, New Identities Across Time and Space, and that's the book that he'll be talking to us about tonight. And Andrew, I think what is so wonderfully valuable about your work and why we're also thrilled to have you here is that even for those of us who are non-biblical specialists, you really make a case for thinking about the composition of the Hebrew Bible, for taking it seriously and really making it relatable in a way that we can understand it as just a thoroughly human endeavor. And so I'm delighted that you're here to talk to us today.
Well, thank you so much, Laura, and thanks. There seems to be quite a long list of co-sponsors, and thanks for all that. It's a pleasure to see so many people in a room. I know that it's one of the warm spots, Great library here. I don't know if you guys have had I'm pacing back and forth nervously. I don't know if you guys are nervous. I'm a little nervous. The Federalist Papers are over here, the Constitution. We've got the Guns of August, one of the great World War I histories. And over here some Shakespeare, so we're well set up. But I am here today to talk about my book, a little bit less best-selling than those, all things considered. And then hopefully we'll have a nice conversation about it. You live in a world full of Israels. We still have, there's still some people in the back. I want to make sure we have seats. There's a lot of chairs here, but extricating them seems a complicated physical task.
Thank you.
Small chair into it.
I teach at the College of William and Mary. James Madison, a local boy, but one of the only ones who didn't go to William and Mary. His parents were worried that as a slight young man, he would catch a plague from the swamp that I live in. So they sent him to the College of New Jersey, which is now known as Princeton University. All right. You live in a world full of Israels. This is, when you get down to it, quite an odd thing. You don't, after all, live in a world full of ancient Greeces or Romes. You don't live in a world full of Frances. But there are groups claiming to be the people of Israel, or have had that identity claimed for them, on every continent save Antarctica, if only because no one technically lives in Antarctica. There are Israelites in India, the B'nai Israel and B'nai Menashe among them. There are Israelites among the Pashtun of Afghanistan, the Beit Israel of Ethiopia, the Igbo Jews of Nigeria, the Abo Yudaya of Uganda. In America, the Mormons, the Black Hebrew Israelites, and others all claim Israelite identities, and so does the Israelite House of David, which was headquartered nearby in Dayton Harbor, Michigan. In the 19th century, they were famous for their barnstorming baseball team, which they often wore fake beards and so on and so forth. The Harlem Globetrotters of its day, which was notable for playing barnstorming games, even against the great Negro Leagues teams of that era. But the baseball team had an express purpose, and it was as a fundraising arm for the group, which aimed to ingather the lost tribes of Israel here in this very state. And long before that, the possibility of Israel in America would be debated and discussed by such intellectual luminaries as Cotton Mather, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. Dr. Benjamin Rush would tell Lewis and Clark to keep a weather eye out for Israelites on their journey west. The topic of this talk is, for the most part, why and how we live in a world full of Israels. I will, however, take the scenic route in answering it. You might notice that that's sort of a habit of professors, starting with a little discussion of the history and traditions themselves. I'm here today to talk about a book that I wrote called The Myth of the 12 Tribes of Israel. I didn't choose the title. Mine was Becoming Israel. And the argument of the book is not by any means that most stories about being or finding Israel are made up, which is the conventional, though not necessarily the scholarly definition of the word myth. That being said, they mostly seem to be, or at the very least, we are not likely to find any evidence that confirms the Israelite ancestry of more than a few of these groups. However, I, more than most scholars of tradition, I imagine, really don't think that matters very much for a variety of reasons. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. So first, we should note that this goes against type. In other words, it certainly seems to be a natural human instinct to want to know whether a story you hear is true or false, and stories of ethnic origin are no different. The problem with this instinct is it makes more sense with an older way of thinking about what ethnic identity is. In other words, the basic problem is that we used to think about ethnic identities as a sort of biological phenomenon, like eye or hair color. We used to think that what made you French or Irish or Turkish or whatever is that once upon a time a great French or Irish or Turkish people passed down a set of French, Irish, and Turkish characteristics, customs, traditions, and practices, and by virtue of being a biological descendant, you received them. The first thing to say about this idea is that it's newer than you might think. It does seem natural and inevitable now. But it actually emerged in its modern form in the late 18th century and early 19th, especially in the work of Johann Gottfried Herder. And you may have heard that name before. Then again, every person in Germany at this time was named Johann Gottfried. It's very confusing. In other words, while there are certain ancient antecedents, it was Herder and others who developed a modern version of the idea. First, he identified ethnic groups with languages. French speakers were the French, Spanish speakers were the Spanish, and so on. And then he argued that groups like the French and Spanish had fundamental, inalienable characters unique to them, which constituted their ethnic identity. In other words, if the Irish, say, had a tendency to be cheerful and musical, then an Irish person would always be essentially cheerful and musical. If the Teutonic nation was essentially grim and warlike, the German spirit would always be fundamentally grim and warlike, and so on. The national character will be passed down by biological descent. From this way of looking at it, whatever your ethnicity originally was, that's what you are today. And it obviously matters a great deal as a result what your ethnicity originally was, Israelite or not. And there's more to it than that. Herder had a vision of ethnicity in which that identity was purest in its original formulation, before being corrupted by advancing civilization. In its original context, this conclusion led to an obsession with folklore. You may know the Brothers Grimm as the collectors of some very weird stories. But they were actually scholars. And what they were up to in the 1820s and 30s especially was collecting German folktales, because the belief was that folktales are the kind of story least corrupted by advancing civilization. And so you could find the reflection of the pure German spirit in it. And if that phrase, pure German spirit, is making you feel a little bit nervous, that's part of the reason why scholars don't really talk in these terms anymore. Collecting folklore was a way of attempting to reconstruct the Germanic spirit as it really was in order to aid in the goal of national revival. This is called the era of Romantic nationalism. In the 20th century, however, scholars gradually realized that ethnic identities are not remotely stable over time, and they noticed a lot of problems with the idea that ethnicity is merely a matter of biological descent. The horrors of the Holocaust did have a role to play here. It was ideas like Herder's that led to the conclusion that only people of pure Germanic descent could be German, no matter how long anyone else's ancestors had lived in the region. The combination of these recognitions led to a general reassessment and ultimately to the realization that actual biological descent has little explanatory power where ethnic constructions are concerned. I did say I'd be taking the scenic route, but we're going to be getting back to Israel pretty soon. Let me give you an example. Originally, the Beta Israel of Ethiopia tended to describe themselves as the descendants of a group of Israelites who came to the region already in the days of Solomon. In their traditions, Solomon had a son with the queen of Sheba named Menelik, who grew up in Ethiopia, but came to Israel as a young man, and went back with a retinue of Israelites and the Ark of the Covenant. If you've ever heard the traditions that the Ark of the Covenant might be in Ethiopia, this is where they come from. Few scholars today accept these traditions as historical, but there's still a lively debate about whether the group might descend from a very early Jewish group in that region anyway. On the one hand, it wouldn't be so surprising. The Jewish kingdom of Himyar, Aksum was the early Ethiopia, was right across the sea, but there's no real evidence that this community existed. Meanwhile, almost every scholar agrees that the familiar form of Beta Israel identity only developed a millennia more later, in the 14th and 15th century CE, especially in opposition to the Christian Solomonic dynasty of Ethiopia, which was founded in the late 13th century BCE, and also claimed descent from the Israelites. In fact, the Beta Israel's own traditions agree that it was in this era that many of their important practices and traditions developed, and many of their important liturgical and scriptural texts, too, even if they claim an origin, an ethnic origin, more than 2,000 years earlier. So really think about it. If we agree that the familiar form of Beta Israel identity formed in the late 14th century CE, what is the nature of the difference between the claim that it happened to a group that was biologically descended from Jews much earlier, or not? What if it was Israelites in the 10th century BCE, or a native group? Either way, the construction of Beta Israel identity happened in a historical context for historical reasons. Meanwhile, where the idea that they were Israelites originally came from, if Israelites came to Ethiopia in the time of Solomon, that's where, what the origins of the ethnic group tells you is where the idea originally came from. If it was Israelites in 10th century BCE, that's where it came from. If a Jewish group in the Aksumite period, that's where. If neither, as I think is most likely, somewhere else. But regardless, that original idea was so modified by time and chance that it became something new and unexpected. And it was adapted to local realities, as all identities are. As I will discuss below, the Beta Israel way of being Israel was predominantly shaped by the fact that the Christian Solomonic dynasty of Ethiopia, which ruled from the 1270s into the 1970s, also claimed descent from Menelik, Solomon, and Sheba. All of which means fundamentally that the difference between one and another of the world's Israels is not that one is real and one is fake, or shall we say invented. That can be true in the sense that some groups are biologically descended from the original Israelites and others are not. But since they both keep creating new versions of Israel over time, we're always studying how someone changed an inherited identity into something new. In fact, we're even doing that when a group has no prior history of identifying as Israel, when they become Israel, like the Mormons did between the 1830s and 1840s. They too have simply created a different version of Israelite identity, shaped by the vagaries of a new time and place. And furthermore, once created, an identity is again repeatedly reshaped by new experiences in reality. So if you, hypothetically, of course, want to study different versions of Israelite identity, that's what each and every one of these would be, regardless of how long their ancestors have been Israelites or Jews. That's identity for you. It should be a terrible political slogan. Running for office. That's identity for you. I don't know what it would mean. We could talk about it in the Q&A. Not surprisingly then, the same basic thing is true even in ancient Israel itself, and for more than one reason. First, say that as the Hebrew Bible claims, ancient Israel formed as a 12-tribe institution, bound by biological descent from the 12 sons of the patriarch Jacob. Even so, Israelite identity would have taken on a different shape when Israel became a monarchy under Saul, David, and Solomon. It would have changed when the kingdom of Israel was conquered by the Assyrians in 722 BCE. Meanwhile, a fact we have known for a long time, whose crucial importance has only recently been acknowledged, there's an important sense in which the Hebrew Bible's own account of Israelite identity is not technically Israelite at all. Instead, the actual texts were largely composed in a place called Judah, which in the biblical accounts split from Israel just after the death of Solomon and had quite a different history. Between the two, there were about 300 years of independent political and cultural activity, including the conquest of Israel, but not Judah, by Assyria in 722 BCE, even before the most productive eras of biblical composition likely began, especially after Judah's own conquest, this time by Babylon in 586 BCE. Many texts were likely written in the so-called Babylonian exile, and after, in the community of Judahites who returned from this exile, which certainly wasn't all of them. And these returnees do not seem, as a rule, to have been too friendly with the community of Judahites who were never exiled in the first place. Part of my project then was to argue that because ethnicity is fluid rather than stable, studying its fluidity over time in different American or African or European contexts is not so different from studying the history of Israelite identity in Israel and Judah themselves. Part of it was to point out that Judahite authors and editors were doing the same thing with inherited traditions about Israel and its past as all the other groups in the book were doing elsewhere. And I think this is an important point. In recent years, there have been a few studies that have, I missed some notes to myself, just a few. I thought I had another slide here. Well, we'll hang out. Anyway, as you can see, the Babylonian Empire was pretty big. These are some of the 12 tribes of Israel. This is one of the things that I think is really interesting, and I'll come back to this. In 2 Kings 17, this is the biblical account of the conquest of Israel by Assyria, and not Judah. What it claims is that literally every Israelite was taken into an Assyrian exile. Israel was exiled from their own land to Assyria until this day. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Awa, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and placed some in the cities of Samaria in place of the people of Israel. They took possession of Samaria and settled in cities. There were deportations, but lots and lots of Israelites remained behind. So one of the things these Judahite authors did is they positioned themselves as the only Israel. I don't really know where I'm supposed to be, so we'll just see what happens with the slides. I think this is an important point because there really have not been any studies that talk about the biblical construction of Israelite identity alongside the construction of other Israels, other places. They talk about how the biblical version of Israelite identity serves as the basis for these others, but they don't really think about how the fluidity of identity in one place is not so different from the other one. So that's part of what I was trying to do. A couple of these new studies, Tudor Parfet's The Lost Tribes of Israel, The History of a Myth, Zavi Ben Dorbanites, The 10 Lost Tribes of World History, they do a great job. But, again, they don't talk about the continuity between one act of becoming Israel and another. So that's what I wanted to do. Above all, however, I thought that if we wanted to study how Israelite identity is constructed anywhere, even ancient Israel itself, we could use the boost provided by studying how Israelite identities are constructed everywhere, using the same basic traditions in different ways in different places. The way I put it in the book was this: every single Israel known to the world built a bridge across a gap of time and space between themselves and the real ancient Israel, the first ancient Israel. And there's a gap here too in the Bible. So there must be a bridge here too. The study of Israel is a study of bridges. Back on track. That's a bridge. I could recognize it anywhere. How they were built, to what, and why somebody would want to go to the other side. So imagine yourself in Judah around 480 BCE. Even if everything the Hebrew Bible says is true, it has been over 400 years since the people of Judah and the people of Israel were part of the same political entity. I don't know what's going on here. I feel like I'm missing something. It has been 100 years since Judah was conquered by Babylon, an event which seemed to have left the imperial provinces that had once been Israel largely alone. So again, Israel here was conquered by the Assyrian Empire in 722, stopped about here. Babylon conquered Judah, caused the Babylonian exile, but the Israelites of Israel don't seem to have been much affected by that. They just had new managers, so to speak, but it pretty much seemed the same. You guys have probably seen administrators come and go. In your time at Michigan State, it's pretty much the same thing. Say that you are a descendant of a group of Judahites who went into Babylonian exile and returned, rebuilding your homes, constructing the second temple in Jerusalem. But there are Judahites who never went into exile in the first place. There are Israelites who are still in Israel, even though 2 Kings 17 says there shouldn't be. There are Judahites who never came back from exile, and you sat down to write a history of your people. One thing we can say above all is that you have some choices to make. Even if your ancestors and the ancestors of the Israelites really were the same group, the various wars that seem to have occurred between Israel and Judah, and the various differences between their historical experiences ever since, might inspire you to emphasize the importance of Judah as Judah and de-emphasize its Israelite roots. Example I always use, sorry Laura, is the American Revolution. Because if after the American Revolution, the Americans went on thinking of themselves as British, you could understand why that would happen. But they didn't, which goes to show that deciding to be something else is an available choice for your Judahites as well. You could choose to tell a story in such a way that you include as many heirs of Israel as possible, Israelites in the exile, Israelites in Israel, Judahites in exile, Judahites not in exile, or you could choose to ignore or even condemn different communities of Israelites besides your own. You could choose to start with Adam, or with Abraham, or with Jacob, or with David. You could choose to focus on any set of events, characterize them in any way, assert the importance and unimportance of whichever you like. Like you could talk a lot about the Constitutional Convention, or you could talk a lot about the American Revolution, or you can talk about, if I canvass the room, how many facts about the War of 1812 would I get? Probably not a lot. We left that one out of the historical memory. There are always choices when you decide how to construct your past. Here's what biblical authors did. First, they emphasized the central importance of all Israel and de-emphasized the separate identity of Judah. The 12 tribes of Israel is an image of all Israel. It's very central to this story. I'll talk about that in some classes tomorrow. They wrote, as I say, the Israelites out of the story. They said that all the Israelites who lived in Israel as opposed to Judah were taken away into Assyrian exile and replaced by all these foreigners. That didn't really happen. A lot of Israelites were taken away. A lot stayed behind, and there's yet no evidence of a lot of foreigners being brought in. They de-emphasized the separate identity of Judah. There are 26 lists of the tribes in the Hebrew Bible. There are 8 in the books of Numbers alone. There are full lists in Genesis 49, Exodus 1, Numbers 1. Blessing the tribes is the last thing that Jacob does before he dies, and in Deuteronomy 33, the last thing Moses does before he dies. The books of Chronicles start with a 9 chapters long genealogy that recapitulates the entire history of Israel in the form of a tribal genealogy. Thrilling reading, as you can imagine. When David becomes king, it is all the tribes of Israel who come to him at Hebron to make their submission. When the kingdom of David and Solomon splits into Israel, that too is described in tribal terms. 10 for the kingdom of Israel under the general Jeroboam, 2 for the new kingdom of Judah. And if you really want to have some fun, try to figure out which those 2 are. It's harder than people think. Well, most people don't think of it at all. It doesn't come up a huge amount. But if it does, it's harder than you think. It's got to be Judah, right? Levites are at the temple. A lot of people think it's Benjamin, but that's already 3. Every description of Simeon, and you guys know all this stuff, in the primary history indicates that Simeon's territory is inside the territory of Judah. So you get 10 and 2. It just says 10 and 2. That's 4. I'm not a math guy, The last time I took math was in the 11th grade. But so as I say, they don't just describe Israel. It's sort of like a murder podcast. They systematically eliminate all the other Israels out there. They not only describe the Assyrian conquest of Israel as a totalizing event, getting rid of all those Israelites, they describe the Babylonian conquest as the same. So Judah went into exile out of its land. But in fact, a lot of Judahites remained behind. And when they came back, a lot of them stayed in exile or diaspora. So the finished version of the story that appears in Genesis through Kings, what scholars sometimes call the primary history, does 2 things, especially when we add in the books that refer to the Persian period in which these texts likely took shape. It, as I say, centers the importance of all Israel and de-emphasizes the importance of a separate Judah. If you've never before thought of Judah as being separate from Israel, even if it will be really weird for 2 different nations to think of themselves as one people more than they think of themselves as 2 nations. I don't think you can think of any other examples. It's because the text, which is incidentally the world's most best-selling book of all time, wants you to feel that way. And then It explains why the entire legacy of Israel now rests in the hands of these Judahite returnees from exile, because there aren't supposed to be any other Israelites around anymore. The Israelites of Israel are not supposed to exist, but they do. Judahites who did not go into exile are not supposed to exist, but they do. Judahites who did not come from exile are not supposed to exist, but they do. So the text navigates through the past in such a way that it is a fundamentally Israelite one, but one that belongs entirely to post-exilic Judahites. Now imagine yourself in America around 1830. You encounter a young man who claims to be a prophet. His name is Joseph Smith. He says he's found an ancient book, a kind of testament that he discovered on a mountain, or a hill, if we're being technical. It tells the story of a group of Israelites who left Israel around, Judah really, around 600 BCE and came to America. Over long generations, they grew and thrived, but split into groups and fought each other. Finally, one side decisively defeated the other, and the last great general of the losing side buried this book, the Book of Mormon, a record of his people's history and accomplishments. And the book includes one more thing, an account of the appearance of Jesus Christ in America after the crucifixion, who gave these American assembled Israelites a sacred charge to build the new Jerusalem in America in order to gather the people of Israel there. Here's a photograph. So this is another story that does two things. First, it explains how Israelites came to America, articulating a version of what is sometimes called the Jewish Indian theory, the idea that the Native Americans are in fact the lost tribes of Israel. Second, it explains how the destiny of these Israelites is superior to that of other Israelites, and that they are unique among the heirs of Israel for possessing this special destiny. Again, we like to think of our traditions about who we are as simply true or false. But the purpose of any of these stories, even when based on the truth, is not simply to report on events, which would not be very useful in explaining who we are. It is to connect us to the past in certain ways and for certain reasons. As a result, every story still navigates through past events in certain ways that are far from universal, which is to say that two different storytellers would chart different paths backwards into the past and explain the significance of the landmarks in different ways. These stories have been shaped to connect different groups to ancient Israel, but also to do additional things. To explain how the exiled Judahites returning are the only surviving Israelites, or how the Mormons in America have the special destiny of restoring Israel in America. So they're building a bridge, and they're both designing a particular kind of bridge to make a different kind of statement. We might want to make a distinction between these two acts of bridge building. We might want to say, well, it matters that the Judahites might be biologically descended from the Israelites and the Mormons are likely not. We certainly can make a distinction between why a 6th century or 5th century BCE group of Judahite authors would want to be seen primarily as Israelites, and why a 19th century American group would. In the first case, the group is presumably trying to win some kind of regional composition to position themselves as the most important, most prestigious, and most deserving heirs of Israel in that region. The second, more modern group wants to identify as Israelites because by the 19th century, Israel was a globally prestigious identity, widely regarded as the chosen people, the subject and object of biblical prophecies. So being Israel did and does mean different things in different times and places. Even so, because both of these groups, and every Israel in the world, has to explain both how the group in question is Israel, how it is connected to Israel genealogically, or how Israel got to one place or another, and what the significance of being Israel is as a regional power, the heir to biblical prophecy. Every group is doing the same thing, and so studying how any group becomes Israel is inevitably revealing, the same way that two different actors putting on, two different directors staging Hamlet, or two different cooks making a souffle, or two different designers making a wedding dress is revealing about those people. And this is our friend Yorick, who was never doing well, has taken a turn for the worst recently. Why and how do we live in a world full of Israels and not a world full of something else? Here's one answer. Because we can. The thing is, from the beginning, Israelite identity was already conceptualized as a collection of parts forming a whole. In other words, from the beginning, Israel was defined as a group of 12 tribes, the descendants of 12 sons born to Jacob as described between Genesis 29 and 35. As a result, there was never anything odd about the idea that parts of Israel could go their separate ways and still be Israel. There was never anything odd about the idea that different parts of Israel could be different from each other and still be Israel. Reuben was divided from Simeon and was still part of Israel. Judah was divided from Israel and was still Israel. When the biblical narrative rhetorically sent a large part of the people of Israel into Assyrian exile, that too didn't challenge the idea that these parts, wherever they were, stayed Israel, or that the parts that remained behind stayed Israel too. So the idea that there could be many parts of Israel in the world at the same time helped do what Arad Malkin has called particularizing traditions. Basically, the fact that both Reuben and Simeon were parts of Israel, but also individual, meant that someone could explain what made Reuben different from Simeon, particular, without jeopardizing their claim to be Israel. Malcolm was talking essentially about the way that different ancient Greek groups claimed descent from the heroes of the Trojan War in order to connect their foundation to the most prestigious of past events. And what we're dealing with here is essentially a modern, much more global version of the same phenomena. We all want to be connected to an august past and explain our prestige and importance. The 12 tribes tradition has 12 trailing edges, 12 keys into the structure of Israel. Especially after the biblical count on purpose lost most of the tribes. So all anyone has to do to be Israel is explain how some part of already partitioned Israel got from there to somewhere else and became something else. As I put it in the book, strange as it may seem, we might make other differences, but it is not really any more difficult to explain how a part of Israel ended up with Jerusalem in the biblical Torah as opposed to Israel than it is to explain how another ended up with the Book of Mormon and the hill Cumorah, the mountain upon which Joseph Smith Jr. discovered the golden plates from which he translated the book. This is called a segmented genealogy. The segments can have individual destinies and remain part of the larger structure. And as the partition structure of Israelite identity is what allows the same tradition to explain at once how both Israelites and Judahites are Israelites, despite different histories, political structures, and destinies, it is also what explains how a conceptual all Israel survived not just its division between kingdoms, but between Israel and Assyria, Judah and Babylon, and the wider Near Eastern and Mediterranean worlds. In later days, the exact same features of the exact same tradition would explain how very different peoples all around the world could still be part of the one and only Israel, across oceans and continents and great gulfs of time. Here we can turn to some examples of how different groups first laid hold of an Israelite identity and then made it their own. When, for example, I was writing the chapter on Mormon claims to Israel, what I was most struck by was how many of the roots of the Mormon Israel were already in place before Mormonism even existed. We'll wait to find out what that means while I drink a little more water. That's how you build the tension, the exciting tension that makes these talks so worth your time. Also, whatever extra credit you might be getting for the classes that you're in. For example, it turns out the possibility that Native Americans might be Israelites, which is the central implication of the Book of Mormon, is nearly as old as the voyages of Christopher Columbus. Columbus himself, who did not believe that he had discovered a new world, did not concern himself overmuch with the origins of the natives he encountered, but the idea might have already occurred to Bartolomé de las Casas, who arrived here in 1502, and it was a very popular idea in 17th century Britain. In 1644, a man named Antonio Montesinos came back from South America, claiming to have encountered the lost tribe of Reuben there, an event which inspired a number of different influential books. One was by the Amsterdam rabbi Manasseh ben Israel, an influential figure who played an important role in lobbying Oliver Cromwell to reverse the centuries-old ban on Jews in England. But he was also in conversation with certain British Puritans, notably John Dury and Thomas Thorogood, who not only embraced the Jewish Indian theory, but also at the same time believed that Britain might really be the new Israel, spiritually and sometimes literally. Ben Israel's book was published in 1650, the same year that Thorogood's Jews in America would appear. Perhaps obviously, most early Mormons were the descendants of British immigrants. This is one of these slides where I get frustrated when I'm watching a presentation when the same slide is up for too long. It's just a personal thing, so I felt like I needed a new slide, even though there's no information on this slide. It's just visually stimulating, so I don't know how common that is. I've never asked, but that's for me. Anyway. Meanwhile, upstate New York, where the young Joseph Smith grew up, was in the early 19th century alive with what scholars call new religious movements. Charles Grandison Finney, the father of modern revivalism, gave his most famous speech in Rochester, New York, in the exact same year the Book of Mormon was published. I like to call it Rocha-cha. It's just me personally again. Not 25 miles away from the Smith family farm in Palmyra, New York, this revival happened. Nearby Dresden, New York would become, in 1844, the site of the so-called Great Disappointment, where William Miller's prediction of the imminence of the Second Coming would fail to come to pass. One of the most interesting groups in the region was the Society of Universal Friends, who set up headquarters in Jerusalem, New York in the 1790s. They were led by someone who had originally been called Jemima Wilkinson, born in Rhode Island in 1752. 1776, a year famous for other reasons as well, Wilkinson suffered a fever and awoke, claiming that Jemima Wilkinson had now died, and in her place was a genderless spirit known as the Public Universal Friend. A friend died in 1819, but the society survived for some time. And in 1826, a Shaker community was established in Sodus Bay, 30 miles from Palmyra, and so on. 1830 is when the Book of Mormon was published. Meanwhile, the exact region that Smith grew up in had a number of native mounds, like burial mounds, where artifacts would sometimes be found. Some were even already arguing, we have speculations in local papers in the 1818 and 1823, that these discoveries were evidence of a titanic ancient battle in the region, quote, just like the one that occurs at the end of the Book of Mormon. In another part of the country, William Henry Harrison himself, 2 years away before becoming president for approximately 5 minutes, wrote an account of the natives of the Ohio Valley, his belief as an old soldier that the famous mounds of that region were the defensive fortifications of a group that would later flee south and become the Aztecs. And while Joseph Smith is famously supposed to have translated the tablets with the aid of seeing stones, it turns out that popular superstitions in the region included already a vibrant belief in magic stones or sticks or glasses or other kinds of practices that could reveal hidden caches of treasure or water or who knows what else. Joseph, as a young man, may already have been a money digger, a sort of water diving, but for buried treasure. In the end, the Mormons would actually explain their connection to Israel in two ways. The Book of Mormon explains the Mormon mission to restore the lost tribes of Israel, including the remnant of those who had written and finished the Book of Mormon many centuries before. In that sense, the Mormons were missionaries to Israel. And even today, Mormon missionary work is often conceptualized as a search for Israelites. You'll often see they go to the Caribbean and they say, maybe the tribe of Naphtali or whoever is in that region. Sensitivity to the Mormon message is supposed to be a sign that you're actually an Israelite. Second, it very quickly became common in Mormonism for the Mormons to believe that they themselves were also Israelites. Originally it wasn't. Originally it was they were looking for Israel. So even today, a common Mormon coming-of-age ritual is the patriarchal blessing, which is based on Genesis 49, in which the initiate tends to learn which tribe of Israel they supposedly belong to. Thus, Mormon tradition first lays hold of an Israelite identity via the explanation the Hebrew Bible already provides, that most of tribal Israel left Israel before the end of the 8th century BCE and went who knows where. Then it gives the global Israelite identity a profoundly local shape with seeing stones and native mounds and so on and so forth in the Jewish Indian theory. The result was a profoundly American Israel, an upstate New York phenomenon clothed in garments woven long before the custom of the lost tribes of Israel. And most of all, performed an action. It explained why this group of Israelites, among all real or potential groups of Israelites, had a special role to play in the unfolding of a divine destiny, because of an experience that happened to this group of Israelites and no other. Similarly, let us reconsider the Beta Israel of Ethiopia. Theirs is a fascinating story because it really features one of the few instances where quite independent visions of Israelite identity encountered each other in the world. Above, I already referred to the traditions of the Kebernegast, or Glory of Kings, an Ethiopian tradition that probably formed around the time the dynasty claiming descent from King Solomon took the throne in the 13th and 14th century CE. As I've already said, this is a Christian dynasty. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is one of the oldest Christian churches in the world, but it claimed descent from Solomon, who in this story had a son named Menelik with the Queen of Sheba. The last member of this dynasty was the famous Haile Selassie, who was overthrown in 73 or 74. When James Bruce, the Laird of Kinnaird in Scotland, became the first European we know in modern times to make contact with the Beta Israel at the end of the 18th century, he found lots of biblical peoples. He said the Amhara, the Agau, and the Gaphat were peoples who had arrived there from Canaan, escaping the armies of Joshua. But as for the Beta Israel, the story he was told at that time was very nearly the one that's told in the Kebernegast, except for the fact that the Beta Israel claimed that in the 4th century CE, when the Christian Israelites had turned Christian, they had stayed true to their original Jewish faith. So it's two groups, both claiming the same story, but differently from each other. This story had a lot of value in Ethiopian society as these things go. It positioned the Beta Israel within Ethiopian society. It was an internal usefulness. They were on the level of kings because they had the same genealogy, and they were better because they stayed true to their original faith. Today, however, the Beta Israel live almost entirely in Israel itself and are perhaps the only group officially identified as a lost tribe of Israel that ever achieved full legal recognition by the state of Israel, which means being entitled to Israeli citizenship. And how that came to be has less to do with the Beta Israel's own traditions, but really quite an extraordinary historical coincidence. I'll trail off there for, again, dramatic tension. This late in the talk, maybe you just want me to finish it and move on, but maybe that tension is what's keeping you into it. Who knows? I don't. What happened is that in 893 CE, a man calling himself Eldad Hadani arrived in Kairouan, in what is now Tunisia, presenting himself as a member of the lost tribe of Dan. He said the Danites lived in the land of Cush. The Kairouani Jewish community wasn't so sure, especially because some of Eldad's religious practices struck them as pretty strange. And while in principle there's nothing very surprising in the possibility that the lost tribes might do things a little differently, in reality, many Jews now and then believe that the Talmud, which codifies Jewish religious laws, was a distillation of an oral law as old as Moses himself, which is to say, from before the lost tribes got lost, so they should do things the same way. So disturbed by these differences, the Kairouani sent a letter to the Gaon, or head of the Jewish Academy at Sara, one of the most important Jewish centers in the world, and they said basically, what's going on with this? What's its deal? The Gaon responded that it seemed fine to him, and he believed officially. Jewish law often works like the Supreme Court in America, which is based on precedent. So this is an official precedent that the Danites of Cush are officially recognized by the premier Jewish authority of the 9th century. The thing is, Cush had long been identified with Ethiopia. But at the time, it's likely enough that the Beta Israel didn't even exist. The Kebernegast hadn't been written. The Solomonic dynasty was not yet on the throne. But in the 16th century, this rabbinic ruling was actually applied to a Beta Israel for the first time. Essentially what happened is that an Egyptian man wrote to another rabbinic authority because he had purchased an enslaved person from the Cairo slave market. And he said, this guy says he's an Israelite. Do I have to let him go? And the rabbi says, yes, he's an Israelite because 700 years ago, 600 years ago, again, not a math guy, this Gaon of Sora had officially identified the Israelites of Ethiopia as the lost tribe of Dan. And so now there was yet another rabbinic precedent, this time attached to the actual Beta Israel. And finally, in 1973, when Rabbi Avadia Yosef, the chief Sephardic rabbi of the state of Israel, ruled that the Beta Israel should indeed be regarded as full members of the Jewish people, he said, quote, there is no doubt that the aforementioned authorities who ruled that they are the tribe of Dan carefully investigated and reached this conclusion on the basis of the most reliable testimony and evidence. Again, the Beta Israel had their own traditions, and the Dan thing doesn't feature in them. Cush itself is a biblical name long applied to Ethiopia, but of course is much older than Ethiopia itself. But what genuinely seems to have happened, as I put it in the book, is that an Israelite and Jewish identifying people appear to have developed right where Jewish legend long suspected that they lived, long after those suspicions first developed, and quite independently from them. And in the end, that suited the Beta Israel just fine for the most part. They couldn't leave in the 1970s. The ruling came down just as the Solomonic monarchy was overthrown, and the succeeding government, the Derg, would not allow them to go. But the deteriorating situation in Ethiopia made it very desirable to get out. And in the 1980s and 90s, they succeeded in relocating almost entirely. In short, we can put it this way. The Beta Israel vision of Israelite identity was like the Mormon vision of Israelite identity, formed not only by, but for its native environment. It too took the Bible, especially the account of Solomon's encounter with the Queen of Sheba, which is in 1 Kings 10, and created a vision of Israel that made sense in context, one which connected the group to a community of Israelites that indigenous traditions had long claimed were there, and positioned them vis-a-vis the Ethiopian royal house as a still more prestigious group. So for that matter, did the royal house itself. Over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, the community encountered another story of Israelite origins, one that facilitated a population move that was greatly desirable for multiple reasons, and so they left one Israel and became part of another. It is indeed the 12 tribes tradition with its flexible structure that makes it possible for so many groups to claim an Israelite identity. It is the fact that the Bible is such an important book that has historically made it desirable and given many options for achieving that end. We learn a lot when we learn to pay attention not to the fact that a group claims an Israelite identity, which is that historical truth or fiction question, but how and why. These are the major, and there's still some controversies over the Beta Israel that are still in Ethiopia and how they might get there that I'd be happy to talk about later on. The Hebrew Bible's own traditions about the tribe not only were, but typically are, analyzed primarily by biblical scholars in their capacities as reflections of historical reality, despite the fact that we acknowledge that the vast majority were written more than 500 years after a conceivable tribal age. For scholars who don't think that they are reflections of historical reality, that typically is what they find interesting about them, that someone came up with the 12 tribes concept at some point for some reason. For scholars who do think they're historical, there's a familiar way of doing business that I call the preservative method of analyzing these traditions. They're interested in what these texts preserve. They analyze the text by treating them as a kind of code that they need to break. If Judah is the son of Jacob's first wife and Benjamin of the second, it means that once upon a time Judah was more powerful than Benjamin. If Judah has 5 brothers, children of the first wife Leah, and only 2 of the second wife Rachel, it means that a 6-tribe league, including Judah, predated the formation of a 12-tribe league, and so on. But evidence not only from biblical tribal traditions, but ancient Greece and anywhere else that these kinds of genealogical traditions exist, tell us that people do not simply encode a map of society in these traditions and pass them down. They're always messing with them. I often use the example of Alexander Hamilton. You might have heard of him. But maybe you wouldn't have 20 years ago, right? The fact that stories about founders are passed down can't predict that suddenly there's going to be a massively popular musical that all of a sudden makes somebody part of the stories that we keep telling over and over. So you get these traditions, even in ancient times, you use them, you manipulate them to claim prestige or some kind of advantage to justify a war, to make overtures for peace. You can say, hey, we're brothers, so we should be friendly. Or you can say, like, we're different, so we should fight each other. You can do all kinds of things. How little would we learn if we decided that the only interesting thing is that both were claiming to be Israelite, which they started doing at a particular point for particular reasons, and left it at that? How much more do we learn if we ask instead, not just when, but why and how did the realities of a particular place shape the new Israel that has now emerged? And so in the book, in place of either a cultural invention method or the preservative method, I proposed a redescriptive method. One that started with observations I had already made, that every vision of Israel, whether based on real biological descent or not, is repeatedly redescribed over time. This is Bruce Lincoln on how segmented genealogical traditions are used to create new realities. In other words, the same processes before and in the same tradition are at work in remaking visions of Israel over time in any given place, as are at work in creating new visions of Israel in a new place. And we can study those processes all the better when we refuse to ignore them, when they use one kind of material rather than another, when they are, really based in biological descent or not. If every Israel is half a shared set of inherited traditions and half its application to new contexts, what can we learn by examining the whole range of what can be done with those inherited traditions? And here I would like to make one final point. I know it's exciting to hear the word final in talks like this. Biblical scholars often bemoan the fact that nobody reads our stuff. And unfortunately, we, meaning the discipline as a whole, are not so good at reading anybody else's stuff. As a result, biblical studies benefits less from comparisons than most, and theory developed for the study of the Bible has less impact than other fields, less impact on other fields than most. But the reality is that we have in this case a perfectly normal kind of group activity, the construction of new identities and new versions of identities out of inherited traditions. If, for example, you feel American, it is not just because your parents and grandparents were born here, if they were. It is because you participate in a shared sense of what being American means, usually ordered around a set of shared stories about July 4th, 1776, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, hot dogs on July 4th, and so on and so forth. What makes the Israels of the world different from American identity or French identity and so on, it's that it's a lot of groups that we are accustomed to thinking of as different from each other that are constructing their identities using the same traditions. Many cultures that are different from each other in a lot of ways, nevertheless, have essentially the same view of the importance of the same book, the Bible itself. So it only makes sense that among the identities a group can have, biblical identities are frequently developed. But it is odd. Like I say, we don't have a lot of Frances, we don't have a lot of Greases, we have a lot of Israels. Thus, one point to make is the answer to the question of why we live in a world full of Israels. Everyone is looking for a prestigious past. The Bible has prestige all around the world. And we always build identities out of what we have to hand. It is a common thread for cultures all around the world, a desirable past and an intelligible past, culture to culture. Finding a way to connect any present to that past makes sense because it is particularly useful for doing what pasts are supposed to do in presents. Make us look good, make us look better than the rest. Then, in addition to the ubiquity of these traditions, there are special features of the story that make it more than usually possible to claim an Israelite identity. Namely, that there are 12 different tribes, 12 different keys into the case of ancient Israel, 12 different ways of making a claim to an Israelite identity that is only amplified by the fact that the Bible ultimately writes 10 out of the story and doesn't tell you where they go. Things that are lost, like the lost tribes are supposed to be, can of course turn up anywhere at all. So the story is plausible, prestigious, and easy to connect to, relatively speaking. The other is that becoming Israel is a phenomenon that has a capacity to teach us about identity itself, helping to break the stranglehold of visions of identity that make too much out of biological descent. What is confusing about ethnic identity has long been that we now know that ethnicity is not a biological inheritance, like hair or eye color, but you still tend to get it from your parents and grandparents. But genetics are not all we get from our ancestors. We also get stories. And they do not have to be stories that are only ours, only German stories for Germans, only American stories for Americans. Therefore, our identities do not have to be only ours, only native grown. Whatever is given to us is available to us, wherever it comes from. And we make what we want, whatever makes sense, whatever works. And so, Israels have been planted all around the world. Thank you.
we have time for questions. If you raise your hands, I'll bring you the microphone.
Or just shout. It's fine too. I'm happy to talk about any part of that. Identity, different Israels, different anything that may interest you. You flew me all the way out here. I don't know anybody. I'm just hanging out. So feel free to ask whatever.
Thank you. Is this my... Okay. You mentioned that I think only one tribe was identified as one of the original, though why did they choose that group over others?
That's a great question. So Israel, as you may know, has guaranteed citizenship to anyone who can claim a Jewish identity. So I'm Jewish. The idea isn't even that I could become a citizen of Israel, it's that in some level I already am, and I just have to show up to claim it. So what I actually said is that of all the tribes that are considered lost, so the tribes that are originally in Israel, there's only one group outside of Israel that has been recognized as one of those, and that's the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, who were recognized by Israel's religious courts as the tribe of Dan. And that's because of this story of this random guy who showed up in North Africa claiming to be a Danite from that region. And so there was a long history of rabbinic authorities believing Danites lived in that region before they ever actually met the Beit Israel. But there are people in Israel, for example, the Samaritans, who claim descent from the Israelite tribes, who do identify as the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh and Levi, which are also supposed to be, Ephraim and Manasseh are also supposed to be lost tribes. They're officially recognized for the most part too, but they lived in Israel for thousands of years. And for whatever reason, Jews don't identify by tribe anymore, and they haven't for 2,000 years as far as I know. So we are considered to be the descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel, but we don't know which individual tribe we're supposed to descend from. Usually, Judah.
Thank you.
Great question.
Yeah.
I kind of have one. It's sort of building off what you just said earlier. So, you mentioned throughout history, it's always focus on which tribe is someone from. Dan, an example for Ethiopia. It's the Mormons pick one tribe to identify with. I guess is there a reason why that's not really a thing anymore nowadays compared to that importance that it had 100 even 100 years ago?
That's a great question. Yeah. So as far as I know, already by the 2nd century CE or so on, Jews are not identifying as tribes. In the New Testament, Paul talks about being a Benjaminite, so it's at least that old. But it stopped being the case. There are still some Jews who identify as descendants of Aaron, which means that the Levites are still technically around, but mostly they just don't do it. But even today, the Mormons, when they come of age, are told, you're a member of this tribe. The Samaritans do identify as Ephraimites, Manassites, and Levites. The Beta Israel, I think some of them at least, have adopted the idea of being Danites. So it's just two different modes, and it's I think if you feel the need to explain how you're an Israelite, the fact that the Bible doesn't tell you where most of the tribes are makes it advantageous to claim to be a tribe. And it really goes to show how much, by the end of this history, the 12 tribes of Israel function as a symbol rather than a reality. Because the biblical authors don't know where most of them are. They don't, There's a scene in Ezra 6, which is about the Persian period, which is the last period of biblical history, where they finally complete the second temple, and they do a sacrifice with 12 bulls or goats, I think, for all the 12 tribes of Israel. The authors of that text didn't believe the 12 tribes lived in Judah. They didn't believe the 12 tribes were there anymore. So it's a function of it's a symbol of a unified Israel that is particularized for groups who need a particular claim. And then if they don't, they often don't worry about it anymore.
And I have a question that builds on that, because in thinking about the remnants, right, of this tribal identity within contemporary Jewish identity, and one place where I see a remnant is every Friday night when I I'm lighting candles, and I bless my 2 children, who are both boys. And so I bless them to be, in Hebrew, like the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, right? Which is part of the sort of standard blessing formula, right, for children, the patriarchal blessing. And it's always struck me as really odd, because, and if you can pull up the segmented, one of the sides of the segmented genealogies, but Ephraim and Manasseh, like, they're not...
they're down here.
They're down, right? They're all the way down there. They're not. They're not all that kosher in all sorts of ways, right? Because Ephraim and Manasseh, they grow up as sons of Joseph in Egypt. So functionally, they're not growing up as part of like the family, to use a Godfather-esque kind of metaphor. Right? They're probably doing all sorts of unkosher things, right? And in Egypt, and they're sort of not. So it's always why, right?
That's a good question.
Why are we invoking these 2 figures in particular, and what does that tell us about the sort of segmented tribal identity that you explore in the book?
That's a great question. So one fun thing you could do, again, I'm a biblical studies professor, so what's fun for me might not be fun for you, but you can just count how many tribes are supposed to be on here, because if you did, you would find 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, which is a lot for 12 tribes. So what happens in Genesis 48 is that Jacob blesses Ephraim and Manasseh and says, like, they're going to be like my own now. And throughout the Hebrew Bible, there's an almost even split between lists of the 12 tribes of Israel that contain Judah and Levi, and ones that contain Ephraim and Manasseh instead. But what's going on is it shows once again that we want to make this debate about history. Where are the tribes really? But it's about tradition. Ephraim and Manasseh are the only ones that are blessed individually by Jacob in Genesis 48 in a way that talks about how great they're going to be in the future. So because that is a biblical text, people have latched onto it as a ritual practice that they do now. Genesis 49 has some of that in it for the other tribes, but actually in Mormonism, most people want to be Ephraimites and Manassites for the same reason, because we happen to have a biblical text that underscores those 2. So we like to think that like we're just doing the math of history, but people are orienting themselves to the most prestigious traditions. Yeah.
Thank you.
At the time the stories were forming or being documented, is there any theory that there may have been a political aspect to the 12 tribes, and that they were a way of, they represented various groups of people, and they were a way of exerting control over them?
I think that's a great question. So most scholars think that most texts about the tribes were written in the exilic period after Judah was conquered by Babylon in 586, or in the return from exile that happened shortly thereafter. So at that time, probably a lot of tribes no longer existed. But the big question is, how related are these 2 earlier stories that existed and that were just written down at that time? And that's what we don't know. But I think what it clearly does is it emphasizes all Israel, as opposed to the perhaps more natural division of Judah and Israel, which are 2 different kingdoms, which often fought each other and so on and so forth. So I do think that it shows how powerful the agenda is, the political agenda of the author, that they are choosing to say all Israel belongs together, as opposed to saying that the tribes of Judah and the tribes of Israel are different, we're different peoples now. And I think that what you get when you have segmented genealogies like this is you get a playground, which people can just keep playing in different ways. And that it was used, the same tradition was used politically by different people for different reasons. So there are traditions that talk about how great Judah is compared to the other tribes, and you can understand how somebody would say, like, yeah, there are 12 tribes and Judah is the best. That's going to be a Judahite pursuing a political agenda. I haven't worn shoes that aren't sneakers in a long time, so if you see me, kind of. But then if you read Genesis, 37 through 45, it talks about how Joseph, even though he's the youngest, the second youngest, is actually the best. And that's what people can do when they have a segmented genealogical tradition. They can always talk about, like, this one is the oldest, so he's the best. This one's the most prestigious. It allows you to position yourselves compared to the other groups. So I wouldn't say there's just one political agenda. I would say that there's a platform for pursuing political agendas, and that we really see that in a lot of those. A lot of scholars think that the reason that Manasseh and Ephraim replaced Joseph and Levi is that Levi became the priestly tribe and kind of stepped out of the 12 tribes, and then they wanted that number 12, so they split Joseph into two. I don't think so. Because I think a lot of the traditions that describe Manasseh and Ephraim instead of Levi still have Levi in there, but they have all the tribes getting together to give Levi presents and stuff. So I think it's actually a Levitical agenda to say, like, we're not one of the 12 tribes, we're better, we're the special tribe. And I think you see a lot of that throughout. But it's a different way of reading the text than people technically tend to do, and I've done a lot to try to show how that might work. Other questions? No idea what time it is. Love to blame jet lag, but
It is 6:30, so please join me in thanking Professor Andrew Tobolowsky for visiting us.
thanks so much for coming. Really appreciate it.
If you're here as part of a class, don't forget to sign in so that you get that credit.